You're listening to the Our Erie podcast with Marty Nwachukwu,
Lydia Laythe,
and Davona Pacley.
This series will bring citizens, entrepreneurs, activists, politicians, artists, and thought leaders to the table for a frank discussion around societal issues facing our post-industrial city and the United States at large. Take a seat.
So everybody, welcome back to Our Erie. We've been reading Black Indians, and for the last, it's been a month. We wanted to bring people who are signed up for the book club to bring them on so we can have a good discussion about the book. So without further ado, I'll let the beautiful ladies, let them know who you are.
Yeah, hi. My name's Leah Tate. I grew up here in Erie, just moved back this past April. So I'm excited to be back, excited to, get engaged more with the community, and super excited to get into this conversation about Black Indians, the book, because it's a conversation topic that I've been having with a friend of mine who is Black and Native. So I'm excited to see what comes from this conversation.
I noticed, sorry, I don't mean to cut in, but I noticed you have a PhD after your name in the intro. Do you have a PhD in something, and can you tell us about it?
I do. So I have a PhD in community engagement. I was in Pittsburgh for the past 7 years doing all of the grad school. So I went to Point Park University and did my dissertation on Black women's experiences with sexual violence in the context of higher education. And so, community engagement, I took that, to look at university and institutions of higher education as community and how we can apply community engagement strategies to better support students, particularly students from marginalized groups.
Wow. Holy smokes. Okay. I'm impressed. That's awesome.
Yeah, thanks.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. It's important work. All right. Who wants to introduce themselves next?
I'm Molly Monahan Lang. I grew up in Erie as well, and through bunches of changes, I'm back and I teach at Penn State Barron, and I teach sociology. I'm the only sociologist there. But I would love to have Leatra speak in my class maybe one day, if she'd be willing. But yeah, I teach sociology of family. I teach medical sociology. I teach all the criminology, juvenile delinquency classes. But through all of my work, race, social class, gender, sexuality, the intersections are key. So also, just as a side note, we have 3 kids, and one of them is in 5th grade and just learning about the age of exploration. So he and I have been talking a lot about what he's learning and the problems with what he's learning, right, in the curriculum. But also there are some good attempts from his teachers, I think, to be a little critical, but it's tough. I think the whole structure is really bad. And so just even reading just a little bit of this book, I kept thinking, wow. There's a lot missing from the stories that these teachers are telling young people. And, for a lot of students, they don't really get a critical mindset until or unless they go to college in the classroom setting. Right. So, and especially white kids, I would say, right? Because so many other people are getting that critical mindset from a bunch of different sources. But for white kids, I would say school is a really good opportunity that's missed until they're adults, which is pretty late, right, in the scheme of things. So anyway, I can't wait to listen. I'm here especially to listen and contribute where I can. So thank you so much for having me.
Yes, thank you for sharing.
Again, impressive. Oh, this is awesome.
It is awesome. And so to the listeners, I lied. We do not have just 3 people in the room that are with us today. We also have Buster, and that is my apologies. I'm so female focused and forward right now, y'all. Like, I'm sorry. That's really my apologies, Buster. Buster's in the building with us. Buster is not just Lydia's beautiful husband, but Buster also photography. So I'm gonna let Buster also explain who he is.
Oh, well, thank you for including me, Davona. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, I'm married to this lovely lady right here. So yeah, like historical nonfiction isn't like, and it hasn't been like the book I usually reach for in the libraries or anything. So this was different for me, but it was a great read, and it definitely was thought provoking, and I learned so much through this book. Um, and it was an opportunity to hop on this podcast. So I was like, yeah, I'm in there. Um,
Yes.
'cause I always have to wait outside the door, and, like put my ear up to the door, and like get the sneak peek. And that's how I get in the podcast. I'll sound like a cat every once in a while. I don't know if you hear me, but no, yeah, I guess that's my introduction. I mean, I'm a father too. That's a pretty important thing about me. I work with people with intellectual disabilities, but yeah, to follow up the first two introductions, I mean, that was, I can't follow that up.
It's all good.
We're honored to have you. So I thank you, Buster, for explaining who you are.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Madeline?
Okay, so my name is Madeline Preshak. I'm going to start with, I have a master's degree in counseling from Gannon. So that focused on child and family studies. And the reason for that is because I have always wanted to be a stay-at-home mom. So as soon as I graduated, it actually right before I graduated, I got pregnant with my first son. So I have been a stay-at-home mom for 7 years ever since, with the degree in my back pocket, knowing like I will do something after once my kids are older and out of the house. But I just want to say thank you for inviting me on here. I'm so humbled by you as hosts and like all the guests that you have had on here. Like you're so inspirational to me, and it's like one of the highlights of my week to listen to this podcast. So thank you so much for having me. And then more recently, like in my own reading and studies, I have done a lot of like trauma focused work, specifically like intergenerational trauma, like studying my past. I've been through a major loss in the last 3 years. So just studying like my family lineage and where the trauma comes from. So I think that can relate to this book really well. So in terms of that and like collective trauma.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Yeah.
Side note, you're part of the gang with the tapestry and the salt lamp.
Well, you stepped away, Madeline. We were saying that because we joked that like we all have our salt lamps, we all have our tapestries.
Right.
So
So this is my husband, but this is actually my kid's like craft table. So I was like, oh, that'll work.
I love the setup. This is going to be a great group. I'm so excited to have each and every person here. And Madeline, thank you for ending that great introduction with your end. So I really appreciate you all. So I think we should dive in. First, I mean, personally for me, I just want everybody's like first response, just starting to read the book. Because my whole time I was like, mouth open, jaw drop, like what the hell? So going around, like whoever wants to go, what was your first experience? Like, or first response?
Okay, so since I just went last, I'll go first this time. Shocked the whole time. Like, I don't really know history that much to begin with, which like I don't really mind because it's obviously been changed up in the books that I learned in it anyways. But yeah, just utterly shocked and once again humbled by like the hard work of the people that are mentioned in this book and how much they did not get any type of recognition or anything for the work that they did. It was amazing to me how just repeatedly they got screwed over. It was incredible. And then the other thing that stood out to me so much, what I kept going back to through the book was the statements about how Africans and Indians had like shared values. And those values, I'm going to read them off from the one line that I kept going back to was, family was of basic importance to both, with children and elderly treasured. Religion was a daily part of cultural life, not merely practiced on Sundays. They shared a belief in economic cooperation rather than competition and rivalry. They were proud, but they weren't weighed down by prejudice. So just those things, like if we could all live by those values, I think it would make a huge difference in society today, but I feel like that's lost. in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and Buster, you said something really similar to that when you were reading it. Do you want to like share?
Yeah. I just feel like where we're trying to get now as a country, like, is where we could have been for centuries now. And it's just like, if these white men didn't come to the country and just stir up this racism and these, like, tried to force all these beliefs on the natives, like, we would be living in such a beautiful place. And that's like what we're trying to get back to. But how many hundreds of years later? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think I had that exact same thought. If we had listened back then, it would look so different now.
Mm-hmm.
I agree. When I was reading the book, I felt like I was reading what happens now. So I was like, this is not any different than, like, we're looking at it from the 1800s, but I'm like, it's 2020 or 2021 now. And we're seeing some of the sabotaging of communities, the infiltration of, sickness. And it's interesting when I read this, I'm like, this is not anything that is erased, that this is what we're trying to erase in a lot of the history books. But this book really reminded me that we have a lot of work to do, like, still. So that was one of my very first response, like, thoughts.
Mm-hmm. No, I'm like the same with you, Davona, is like, and I was turning to a page that I had marked off to bring up with that exact point. I write in my books like all the time. So I like take notes in the margins. Like, yeah, I feel bad for anyone that tries to read a book after me because it's not easy. So Buster had to do that. So he knows. But like I even wrote in the margin, like 1880 to 2020, like story sounds the same. And the specific one that I was referencing in the book was about when a Texas white citizen murdered one of the Black troopers. So it was Black people that were like convinced to go like patrol the Indigenous people, right? Because like the wealthy white people wanted to pit everyone against each other to like maintain their classist hierarchy. And so this was someone that was like basically doing the white man's bidding, and the white guy still killed him. And then when that white guy went up to trial, he was found not guilty by a jury of all white people. So like I was just like, everything about that, I was just like feels so much like all of the things we're hearing about today, about like just like the lack of justice, the lack of accountability, like all the issues. Yeah.
I agree 100%. I made some of the same notes about a lot of those issues and a lot of that deeply rooted sort of like segregation that white supremacy tries to facilitate amongst people of color, how that's still happening today. But that also made me think, I was just as sort of like, taking it all in from a historical perspective of like, being super appreciative that these voices and these stories and these names were being sort of like brought into this space, but also like cringing a little bit because I was like, all of this work can be strengthened and supported so much more from a truly like post-colonial critique. So I felt like that element was really missing from the book of, saying like, for example, there was a lot of talk of calling them, dark people or, using these terms without like really talking about what that meant and how that, sort of showed up. And one of the notes that I made was that this is a violence on, part of the author to not do that level of critique and to not bring that conversation into these stories. I think we saw that a little bit in that like final chapter where it was more of like a contemporary and the author like reflecting on his experience and how he sort of got to doing this research in the beginning. But I was like craving that as I was going through and reading through this book. So that was definitely something that felt, as a Black woman, it felt really unsettling to not see that like level of critique as I read through.
There's just not enough written about this, right? I mean, we need more for sure, and more contemporary. I would agree. And I would agree with all that you said, and just add that I just kept getting that feeling of white people being threatened, and feeling threatened. And again, that is so true to this day, right? I mean, one of the things whenever I teach about discrimination, I have to remind people, and it's uncomfortable for everyone, but that a lot of people benefit from ongoing discrimination, right? I mean, it wouldn't continue without that. And I think more white people need to talk about, how they benefit from there being less competition for things, whether it's land, jobs, school, right? Whatever there are only so many slots for or so much space for, right? White supremacy maintains that those opportunities. And it is so disheartening to just think about, though the details change, right? That is still so much a part of, our story as a nation. But we're just a little, well, except for maybe last Wednesday, we tend to be more covert about that now, right? In general, there's more subtlety and a lot more, under the surface stuff going on. But yeah, that just, it's just ridiculous how threatened white people feel on a regular basis and all of the horrible consequences of that. So we have a lot to learn.
I want to jump off of that. Threatened because they do violence, though. Like, the whole book was just a lesson on, for me, this is my perspective, a lesson on the institution of whiteness and white supremacy. And that institution is not like, I don't want anyone in the audience to feel, and I shouldn't feel the need to asterisk my statement, but like, when I say like whiteness as an institution, it's not to say individual white people don't, have their grace, but like, this book was about the destruction of people and the destruction, and like where we are now is about the destruction of people and resources. And it just really stood out to me, all the violence and the bloodshed and the strategy to separate and divide the Native people from the Black people. And it felt like the book was all new information, but it also felt like deprogramming myself from what has been taught to me. Like, so many lessons and the pride that you're taught in school about the Mayflower and Jamestown, and it is all celebrating white colonialism, and it's celebrating, the destruction of Black bodies and brown people. So I don't know. It was just, I was really taken aback reading it, how much we celebrate that stuff, but reading like the bloody details of like what needed to be done to get all these successes that we put in our history books and paint murals for,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I even started a list, I think, at the beginning of this book of like places that I want to consider like not holy ground, but like kind of like how like those historical spaces that like we've given like such significance, like the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia, or like other, that like considered like sacred within like a country or like within our national identity, but like a list of all these places that could be holy ground or sacred, like for like the real heroes of this land. And if that's all that, like if a country is just the land and it's like the arbitrary boundary we drew around the land, then like all the people that occupied this space are like heroes of this land. So I don't know if I want to call them American heroes or like, but like that they are like the heroes that I want to aspire to be more like the people that were in this book, not the people that were in the history books that I read in like 8th grade.
I was going to say shout out to my dad because we traveled all over the US as a kid, but he did not go to Mount Rushmore because he knew like that was stolen land. We can't go there.
I felt empowered reading about the fighters because, I mean, the history of the past is much bloodier and violent than we're experiencing now. But like, I felt like I could relate to them. Like, it's insane what they were experiencing is insane. And I know they're feeling like, am I out of my mind that I'm living and experiencing this? And I have to organize people to fight against this big power. I felt inspired knowing like I'm just part of a greater tradition of people fighting against oppression.
To that point, Lucy Parsons, I made a note when like there was, I think maybe 2 pages or 3 pages about her story, and I made a note with like a little heart, and I was like, Lucy is the GOAT, because like just the way that she sort of tackled all of these sort of like systemic oppression. It's a lot of the like grassroots movements that we're still seeing today. Like she was the model, she was the one that was really putting that stuff in action. And it was really nice to read that story. And I had the same reaction as you, Marty. I was like, I feel empowered, because again, she was really like laying the groundwork for a lot of these movement making initiatives that are still making change today. So it was really beautiful to hear her story in the way that it was told in this book.
Yes. Listen, I don't know about y'all, but I felt rage as well. So I mean, I love the story of Lucy too, but I also felt rage because I'm like, wow. When they talk about stories about in the book about Black women and Native women coming together, and they were the ones that people would go to, like, to make rules, and I'm like, okay, so what happened? Like, what happened in that time, in this time? I felt lots of rage reading this book, honestly, and I was upset also at William Loren Katz, at him, because I felt like, did he have enough conversation with more Black and brown people? I feel like he was coming from his own perspective, and it was not. And I feel like in this book, he should have been more enraged by reading these stories. The way he wrote, like you were speaking to about Leatra earlier, I feel like it should have been where he, I don't know, like you said, broke it down in a way where this was wrong. This was not right. Like, and it kind of was watered down in a way. And I'm like, I don't know. I felt upset at him as well. So that's to start the question of, what do you think about a white man writing this history book about Black Indigenous people? Like, how did I feel about that? And I kind of felt, thank you, but you could have did more. But that's just my feeling. How did you all feel about that?
I actually didn't even know he was white. I didn't see a picture of him. I assumed he was Black. Like,
wow,
that's kind of like that's my fault, I guess. But like, I can't imagine a white person trying to take this on, like, even because I feel like you couldn't capture it, like you said. Like, yeah. But yeah, I was definitely angry and a lot of sad feelings too. Just like, I cried a couple times. I'm like you, Davona. I'm an empath. Like, I have to take breaks. I was like, I have to get through this, but it's really hard.
I don't know. You can go on, but yeah, I was upset.
I felt, and the book was written in the 60s or 80s. Does anyone remember?
I thought it was the 90s. I thought it was the late 90s, but this may have just been the edition that I have.
Yeah, it was 86, and then he wrote that new preface in 2011.
Yes.
Even with that preface that came like years after, I wondered like what this work would have looked like in this era, like if he would have dug in deeper and maybe connected with more Black or Native people. Because I felt it reflected, I don't know. I mean, obviously I wasn't alive back then, but I felt like maybe the tone of it was impacted by the time and era it was written in.
Yeah, and maybe, I don't know. That's the thing. Like, yeah.
That makes sense. Like, it was just less emotion focused back then, I think.
But even then, like, and I gave the book to my mom when I finished reading it. I believe like the last chapter before the edition in 2011 ended on the note of, I don't have my notes open, but it ended with the note of like an entertainer and how he was, like the success of like these two groups meeting. I'm like, that's not how you end this book where a whole bunch of horror happened. Like, there was no reflection at the end, and I was pretty upset with that.
Yeah, who was it? Like, oh yeah, LL Cool J. Just so you know, LL Cool J held the book once, so that's good.
Well, that's good.
Well, I think he mentioned that in like the last little part there, that the only publisher that was interested in putting it out for him was like a young adults publisher. And so there was constraints on like how long he could make the book and like how much like historical, like he couldn't have any footnotes, he couldn't have like so many references at the end. So but again, like if you just put out a new version in, what was it, 2011, like why couldn't you just expand it as much as you wanted? Because I mean, I'm sure at that point he could have had the opportunity to make it longer and get outside of the confines of the young adult publishing. So
that's a really good point. That's a really good point.
Yeah, when he said 200 pages and I was like, well, you only added 40 more? Like, because I wanted to research more. Like I was on Google throughout the book, like looking more stuff up.
Yeah, I mean, I think he's also just confined by his whiteness and his maleness too.
That's true.
Is just like something I think there still is, but I think, again, going back to Marty, your point about like time period as well, but that like there's this sense of like there's a certain truth, almost like science, like that there's an objective reality that happened, and that any sort of judgment, like saying right or wrong, is subjective. And I don't think that that's true. I don't think that there is like one objective reality of things, because it's all about like your perspective, and things are conflict. Like even within this book, like there were also Indigenous people that started enslaving Black people. So like that's also not okay. So it's not that like there was like, oh, all these people were perfect and they were fully just the victim. Like the cycle of violence and trauma like continued within that. But I just wonder too if like in his efforts to seem like legitimate or historically like objective, he devoided all of the judgment or the criticism of it that I think is totally warranted. And I think like Leatra, to your point, that like a post-colonial critique of this or a feminist critique of this or like any sort of critique of this stuff would say like there's like more that we need to unpack within like in between the lines.
Absolutely. And I am much less inclined to be gracious when it comes to that, because I don't want to give him the sort of like scapegoat argument of saying that this writing was just a product of the time, because at the same time, Fannin was writing about post-colonial theory and doing really in-depth critique. There were all of these social scholars who were doing this level of critique and, critiquing society, critiquing, capitalism, critiquing all of these things at the same time that this body of work was being written. So it's not like those, critiques weren't out there. It's not like those models for how to critique weren't out there, in the mid 80s. So, I'm not going to give Katz that out in that particular sense. And, as you all mentioned, he had another opportunity to do that just a few years ago when he, revised the edition, or, even just adding another chapter to say, looking at this in this contemporary lens. There was enough going on in 2011 for that level of analysis to happen. So I don't want to give him that credit. And I feel like it was really funny, Madeline, that you mentioned that you didn't even know he was white. You would have assumed that he was Black. I feel like halfway through the first chapter, or like after the first chapter, I was like, let me Google this person, because I don't know, like, I'm feeling some kind of way about the writing. And then when I did it and I saw, his picture, I saw that it was a white male presenting person. I was like, okay, that makes sense, because a white man would have the audacity to write this in the way that they did. So that was just, really it was really hard for me to move past that as I was reading through it. Yeah.
His writing style was weird to me too. Like he would like jump from a story about a person to another story about a person, but spend so much time, and it was really important. I learned a lot about the Seminole Wars. And I felt like when I picked up the book, I was expecting that kind of in-depth, history. And it was not like that throughout the whole book.
It also wasn't like in chronological order. Like he kept jumping all over, and it was really confusing at times for that reason. But you're right about the people too. Like there would be a heading and then there would be 3 different people within that heading. It was like, which one am I focusing on here?
Yeah. I think one thing I really did enjoy, not enjoy, I guess, about the book, because it's not really much to enjoy, but the one thing that really stood out to me is, in our history, we've been painted the history that we've had 400 years of slavery. But the interesting thing is that we never talk about is that Black and brown people were here before that even happened and transpired. So the one thing that I really, out of all of this, want all of us as even in the audience to understand is that, like, in our history, we really do need to start thinking about rewriting it in a way where it is telling the true story, and the true story that yes, slavery did happen, but Black and brown people were here on this soil before it was the United States of America. It was definitely not United States of America. And so even in this book, when you look at white folk coming over here, seeing how great and cozy we are, you want to get in our space. That's kind of like how I felt. Like, I'm just going to say this is how I felt like when reading the book. I'm like, you're coming over here, seeing what we're doing and trying to infiltrate our space when we're cool. And because you see that we got some goods, you see we living all right, you wanted to, at the time, white folk wanted to take that over and used manipulation and destruction and hatred and pinning Native people against Black people, against African people. Like, that really is some manipulative, like traumatic shit that we are still dealing with to this day.
Thank you for listening to Our Erie. We're so grateful for you and for following us on this journey. We are wrapping up season 1. Next week, we're going to be doing the finale with our behind the scenes people. This podcast is produced by John C. Lyons, Marty Nwachukwu, Davona, Pacley, and Lydia Laythe. Funding provided by Erie Arts and Culture. Music by Corey Cook. We appreciate you for listening to Our Erie podcast. Peace.